Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Sparks Entertainment and Art, where we explore so many interesting aspects about the band Sparks. And people who have been watching the show and hearing some of the things that we've talked about know that there's some things that already really interest me and are starting to emerge as we do the show. And one of them is how fascinating it is how so many people hear the band from so many perspectives, whether it's a personal perspective or whether it's an analytical perspective or something else. But people hear a lot in this band, and it's always a little bit different. And that to me is a fascinating thing. So that's something we're going to talk about today. My guest is Jonathan Dean, who is an associate professor of politics at Leeds University in the UK. And he caught my eye about a year ago with a Facebook post entitled Some Thoughts on Sparks and Neuro-Divergence. That was something I really wanted to explore. And I thought, I'm going to get this show up. And when I do, I am going to have a conversation with Dr. Dean about that. So there's a second topic we're going to explore a little bit too. In his work, Jonathan focuses on, among other things, the politics of popular culture, including popular music. So we're going to talk a little bit about Sparks through that prism. And I think we'll focus a little bit on the Latte album. So with all that, Jonathan, I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here.
Well, I am really delighted to have you. And one of the things that gets me really excited is that you were a fan of Sparks the last few years, but when you saw
Yeah.
the documentary, that kind of triggered something in you and you
Yeah.
started to focus on a little bit.
hmm
And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that process and how after the documentary you started to really dig down into what Sparks is about and what they mean to you and their music. So over to you, and
Yeah.
looking
Thanks,
forward to
Monty.
hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Well, yes. I mean, it's funny because Sparks are a band that for me have sort of been on my radar for a very long time. In fact, if I may, my earliest memory of Sparks is one that holds actually a degree of kind of sentimental value for me because my late dad once said to me when I was playing. So I used to have this like Yamaha keyboard in my house when I was a kid, and I used to kind of play it. And he said to me, kind of jokingly, "Oh, you look like that guy from Sparks when you play it," because supposedly I pulled this very stern, serious face, and I didn't know who Sparks were. And then around
Right.
sometime later, um, uh, my parents were watching this TV show that was on in the UK at the time called Sounds of the '70s, and I saw Sparks on them, and my dad said, "That's the guy you look like when you play your keyboard." And I didn't really sort of think anything of it from the time, but I had this kind of fond association with them. And then my next association with them was the fact that, I mean, basically, in terms of music, I'm basically an electronic music nerd. I mean, that like synth pop is kind of my first love musically. And obviously, I became aware of the fact that several of Sparks' albums from the late '70s and early '80s are obviously really important in that respect. The albums they did with Moroder, and so in that context, I bought the Number One in Heaven album, and I've always really liked it, and I still consider Number One Song in Heaven to be one of my favorite, literally one of my favorite songs of all time. But I still thought of them as being, my perception of them was that they had this brief electronic phase, but for most of the rest of their period, it wasn't really music that would be kind of up my street. And then and then the Edgar Wright documentary came out, and I'd actually seen a few of Edgar Wright's previous films because I'm also a bit of a horror nerd, and I had seen Edgar Wright's film Last Night in Soho, which is kind of like a homage to the Italian horror movies of the '70s that I really love. And I was like, oh well, and I'd seen that he'd done this documentary about Sparks, so I watched that as well. And it was really pivotal in terms of making me think, oh man, yeah, I really need to get into them properly. And I kind of felt, I think a lot of people felt like this. I kind of felt bad that I hadn't really appreciated the breadth and the significance and the and just how prolific they had been over the course of their career. So I'm kind of trying to make up for lost time a little bit
Well, it is amazing, and that's part of the reason that I find them so fascinating. But
Yeah.
before we talk about the topic of the neurodivergence topic, I want to
Mm.
go back. You said you're a fan of horror films. Did you ever see Dawn of the Dead?
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
This,
Yes.
well, I'm in it. I'm a zombie in that.
No,
Yes, I
no.
am.
Uh,
And I was in a theater company. I was 18. We went and we were extras, and then they called me back, and I did a whole bunch of scenes.
oh
So
wow.
yeah, I can
Oh,
tell
that's
you if you want to
astonishing.
find me, I can tell you where to find me.
That's fantastic. Oh, you've got to give me the timestamp for that.
I will
That's
do that. I
fantastic.
will do
That
that.
is superb.
But
So
back. Let's get back on topic a little bit.
yeah, sorry, yeah, yeah,
But
sure,
I
sure.
was so happy to hear you say that because that's my film career. Um, uh, okay, so I mentioned you wrote a post, some thoughts on sparks and neurodivergence. It caught my attention,
Mhm.
and rather than me trying to summarize it or somehow, I'm going to hand it over to you, and maybe you can
Okay.
talk a little bit about that and what you hear in the music and all those things. I think you know where we're going. So over to
Yeah.
you, Jonathan.
I mean, uh, I mean, I think this is a fascinating question. I guess I should preface it just by sort of saying my own kind of relationship to this, which I admit is one which for me is still a little bit kind of difficult and a little bit fraught. So basically, you know, over the past few years, I've come to accept that I am probably neurodivergent in some sense, right? I don't have a formal medical diagnosis, but I've been reading a lot about it, talking to people about it, and that's obviously happening in a context where I think in society more generally there is greater awareness of different forms of neurodivergence, like autism, ADHD, things like this. So I don't claim to be particularly expert.
Right.
There are lots of people in the autistic community who are far more sort of expert about the kind of either the medical side of things or the sort of cultural and social side of things. So I don't want to claim any expertise about that. But
Sure.
certainly, but in terms of my own kind of understanding of and relationship um, to kind of neurodivergence, and in my case specifically autism, I mean, I feel quite strongly that there are a number of songs in the course of Spark's back catalogue that can, I think, be read as being descriptions of or reflections on the lived experience of either autism in particular or neurodivergence um, more generally. Um,
So when you talk
yeah,
about this, it's in the context of the songs, or is there a bigger picture in terms of the band and how they present themselves and their music?
throughout their, like I say, throughout their career, I think we can trace a number of songs that, for me anyway, describe very vividly the lived experience of neurodivergence.
Okay, so let's get
I,
into some of the
I,
songs.
yeah, okay.
I think that's a great way to frame it.
So, so, I think the first one where I really that made me sort of think about this in a really direct way is the song "When I'm With You," right? Which is about which, from well, to put it simply, describes quite accurately my own relationship with my partner, or why it was that I felt that I often feel like, you know, um, it describes in quite a nice kind of wholesome way what I like about the nature of the relationship I have with my partner, which is that I go about in the world and you know I feel I'm quite a nerdy guy. I feel a bit I'm quite socially awkward. I have various other traits that mean I find various forms of like vaguely normal human interaction quite challenging in certain ways. And I feel like the song describes an experience of somebody whose general day-to-day life is, in a rather vague and unspecified way, difficult or challenging in some way. But when they are with their partner, they feel relaxed, they feel at ease, they feel safe. Um, and I feel like that's quite an accurate description of my own experience of neurodivergent. But there is, sorry if I may, there is one other element to the song that I absolutely love, which I think illustrates it really well, which is the fact that, you know, there's the line where it goes, it's the part of the song where I should say something special, but the pressure is on and I can't think of nothing special. And I feel like that, so for me, right, I feel like I go about in the world and there are just all these, to me, sort of unexplained or implicit kind of scripts and expectations that we're expected to follow, right? And often when I'm in a situation, there will be situations where I understand the script I'm supposed to follow, but it doesn't come spontaneously or naturally to me, and then I kind of become a bit stuck. And I think that's quite a common experience for neurodivergent people. And that's certainly how I feel in a number of situations. To such an extent, I played the song to my partner. I was like, "Look, you got to listen to this. Doesn't this describe me exactly?" And she was like, "Oh yeah, no, it does actually."
No,
So
it's
that's that.
funny. People really drill down on that line when I
Yeah.
get into conversations about the music, and that song comes up. People drill down on that line, and what you said is such an interesting way to look at it.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
now it's gotten me thinking of other songs where there's that's expressed in different ways, like "Don't Leave Me Alone with Her." I'm sure
Right.
there are
Right.
others, but
Yeah.
I think it's a great point.
Yeah. And then, the other, I think the song that is, although that was the first song where I sort of alighted on this idea, the song of theirs that I think is conveys that most vividly for me anyway is when do I get to sing my way, which I know there is a standard interpretation of that song, right, which is that it is about celebrity, right, and a
Right.
kind of and the protagonist Russell sings the song from the point of view of somebody who is, you know, trying to achieve a degree of celebrity status and fails. And I think that's certainly a plausible interpretation of the song. but but for me, the celebrity status that the protagonist is aspiring towards and desires, I think, can be read as a kind of allegory for what it's like being neurodivergent, right? A desire for a certain kind of uh, normality or a certain kind of alignment with the world that never quite arrives, right?
Hmm.
And so it's like you never quite have your your moment in the sun where you sing my way, because the
Hmm.
world, the kind of what we call the neurotypical world, is kind of set up in a way that um, means that there's always a certain unease or distance, right, from kind of dominant behaviors, practices, social norms, whatever. Sorry, I do want to sort of bracket that by saying, I don't want to sort of sound like I'm feeling sorry for myself about this. And in fact, that's one of the
I
things I
don't
like.
I don't
That's one of
think
the
that
things.
comes across at
No,
all.
sure, but that's what I like about Sparks is I don't feel like they are feeling sorry for themselves. I feel like it's I feel like they detect a frustration, but also a humor in those kinds of situations, and I think they also affirm how those situations can also be sites of pleasure and sites of creativity, as well as being a site of kind of frustration and annoyance. Anyway, sorry, but if I may just quickly just finish, with explaining about when do I get to sing my way. So I think it's the second verse, which I just feel is just such a wonderful evocation of the lived experience of certain forms of neurodivergence. So where it goes, there's a tradition, they say, like a bright Christmas day, and traditions must go on. And though I say, yes, I see, no, I really don't see, is my smiling face still on? And I just feel that's wonderful. I like that. Uh, for me, it resonates because I've always had a slightly ambivalent relationship with Christmas. um, but it's also a reflection of the fact that to be sort of autistic or neurodivergent is often to live in a world where lots of people are doing lots of things in ways that appear obvious or self-evident to them. but to me, it's not obvious or self-evident why certain people are doing certain things, or why um, certain customs or practices or norms should be the way they are. And I feel like that verse in particular captures that sense of frustration, and it's just, and often it's justified through an appeal to tradition. It's like, this is just how things are. And
Mhm.
yeah, for me, that's not that's not in and of itself a reason to keep doing something. And so you kind of smile, and go along with it. But when they say, my smiling face still on, what does that imply? It implies that there is a smiling face which conceals a certain kind of discomfort, and that resonates very strongly with what in the autistic community is commonly called masking, right? Where you put on a front of neurotypicality or normalcy in order to, in order to function in society. But it's not really it's at odds with your own sort of embodied or psychological sense of the world.
So,
So
uh,
for me that makes that song really powerful. Yeah.
yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. That's really amazing, and it just gets me thinking. One of the overarching themes of Sparks's music is the underdog. The guy
Yeah,
who
absolutely,
just
absolutely.
doesn't fit in, and that you heard that, or is doing his own thing and trying to make
Mm.
it work. And you heard that on the very first album, with, for
Yeah,
example, Big Bands. There's a
right.
song, about,
Okay.
and there's others too. And then you can go through all their music and you hear that. And in some cases, it comes out with that sense of alienation, which I
Yeah.
think you're getting at. And sometimes it comes out a little bit further with that sense of trying to put on your best face.
Mhm.
And it seems to be a constant throughout a lot of their music.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're exactly right. I think that there are a whole myriad of different ways in which people can feel certain forms of distance or marginalization or alienation from mainstream society, right? And neurodivergence is one way that can manifest, but it's by no means the only one. So I think what that means is that I think people who have experienced, lots of different types of um, outsiderness, for want of a better word, can find um, uh, uh, yeah, can identify with central
Mhm.
themes in lots of Sparks music, but without that necessarily meaning that that is in some fundamental sense what their music is about.
Have you given a listen to the Exotic Creatures of the Deep album?
I'm, I'm afraid I have. I'm afraid this is a symptom of the fact that I'm a bit of a Johnny Come Lately with
Oh, well, the
some
only
of
reason
Sparks
why
more.
is I think a
Yeah, go
case
ahead.
could be made that that's what this entire album is about. And
Right.
I did
Okay.
make a case like that, which I'll send you the link to. But it was, I think I would really love to maybe have a follow-on conversation after you've heard it a few times and read my
Okay.
piece, just to see what you think about it in the context that you're describing. And just to put a coda on this one piece, when they performed it live the first few times and they performed the entire album, the last song is called Likeable because he wants to be
Right.
likable. And it's
Right.
really getting to what you're talking about. And they even came out holding a fake smile. So it just ties
Oh,
into
that's
what you're saying.
classic.
Is my
Yeah. Yeah.
smiley
Yeah.
face still
Yeah.
on? He was
Yeah. Yeah.
going
Yeah.
out of his way to hold on a
Yeah.
fake smile, which
Yeah.
is kind of goofy when you see it, but it has a connotation that he's putting on
Yeah.
something to
Yeah.
show
Yeah.
that he's likable.
Yeah. Yeah. But what I love about Sparks is that obviously, you know, the history of popular music is full of examples of people, playing the role of the outsider and singing songs that tap into people's sense of outsiderness. And so obviously Sparks are not unique in that respect. But what I really love about Sparks is that it, there's a there's a capacity to frame that as potentially a source of, like I said before, a source of humor, a source of pleasure, and a source of creativity. So the sort of contrast I always make and it's kind of funny given this that there's a song in there. repertoire called Lighten Up Morrissey. But I sort of the point of contrast would be with Morrissey and the Smiths, right? Now, I did go through a phase when I was younger of being a big fan of the Smiths. I'm sort of a bit past it now, but but there's a kind of, I don't know, there's a kind of pomposity to Morrissey's narrating of outsiderness that I just find a little bit tiresome. It's a little bit kind of, self-pitying, kind of worries me kind of thing.
Yeah.
And
Well,
and what I love about Sparks is that it isn't remotely self-pitying. Like, yes, it does it kind of pokes fun at themselves, and I think that that's great, because I think it makes them better, more interesting artistic work. But I, I, I think it emphasizes the kind of the, the the fact that to be an outsider is not always bad. Like, there's an ambivalence to it. Like, it can be frustrating, but like I say, it's also a space of pleasure and humor as well. And I think that makes them quite unique, I think.
they're willing to make fun of themselves a little bit. And you saw that in some of their videos and some of the things that they did in the 80s. They've always been willing to have a little fun
Mm.
with their image and play it up
Yeah,
too.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So now this was very informative. And I want to spend a little time segueing a little bit.
Mhm.
When we were talking about what we would discuss on the show, you said one of my key areas of academic interest relates to the politics of popular culture.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned that the latest album is actually a very profound depiction of the ambiguities of gender and class in neoliberal times. You're a professor. You're a professor. It's good.
Obviously, Sparks are not a political band in a conventional sense, right? I mean, you're not going to listen to their music and hear kind of like the advocacy of really obvious or explicit political agendas,
No, no.
like you might have done in the work of kind of classic old school folk singers, or in the work of somebody like Rage Against the Machine, or um, Public Enemy. Right? There's obviously no explicit political agenda being put forward, but again, going back to what we were saying a minute ago, right? In terms of the ways in which they narrate and describe and try to capture certain experiences of marginality or outsiderness or alienation, there's an implied or there's a, how can I put this? There's an implied political um, uh, quality or valence to that, if you like, because the reason, I mean, the reasons that certain people feel these forms of outsiderness or alienation, right, are not random, right? They are typically the product of particular ways in which society is organized, and the ways in which society values certain forms of people or certain forms of behavior more than others, and that then produces a range of different forms of alienation. And in making those visible and in describing them in quite vivid terms, I think, I don't think it's too big of a stretch to think of that as being political in a certain sense, even if they're
No,
not
I think you're
necessarily.
making the ties really
Um,
well, and you're really bringing it together into a bigger perspective. I think it's great. It's fascinating. Let's focus on the new album a little bit, or the latest
okay.
album a little
Yeah.
bit,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I've heard it
Yeah.
described as their most political album
Right.
ever,
Okay.
or to date. But I think the context of the way that person was describing it was more in terms of songs like "We Go Dancing" and some other
Yeah.
songs where there is a political, very strong political point being
Yeah.
made.
Yeah.
But I think you're saying something a little bit different.
I'm not sure I would um, go as far as to say that. Well, I certainly wouldn't have the confidence to claim that it's their most political album, but I was thinking that certainly "We Go Dancing" obviously is unusual in their back catalogue, for perhaps insofar as I think it does have a very explicit political message, which is kind of unusual for them. But I suppose I suppose the more general impression I get, and again, look, this is not super well thought out, but there's quite a lot in that album that I think is kind of about gender politics,
Yeah, yeah,
like
that's
broadly
right.
speaking, like, and which I think is interesting. So obviously, they're two guys, they're two fairly old guys, and yet what I think is fascinating is they've produced this album which it addresses, I think, in very interesting ways, a lot of contemporary sort of dilemmas around gender relations in society, the role of women in society. And I think that's kind of fascinating. So, like, like the song about Veronica Lake, for example, I think it's a fascinating historical anecdote from a moment from sort of contemporary American history that's just absolutely kind of pivotal in terms of how in terms of the centrality of the sort of recruitment of women into the workforce during the Second World War is often seen as being a hugely pivotal moment in terms of setting the scene for the really profound transformations in the role of women in American society in the sort of second half of the 20th century. And and I think you can find that sensibility in also songs like the song about the Mona Lisa's packing, right? Again,
Yeah,
that speaks to the themes of the role of women in society, questions of a sort of the Mona Lisa is imagined as a kind of as rebelling against the forms of constraint and confinement that women have historically been subjected to. And then also there's, sorry, I forgot the name of the song. The song about the couple who go on, sort of middle-aged couple who go on a
oh, take me
kind of
for a ride.
take me for a ride.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which again is about a couple who are kind of bored by the trappings of middle of the road suburban kind of domesticity and want to kind of escape from it all. So I suppose the whole album often has these is marked by songs that are kind of about forms of rebellion against social norms, but where that rebellion is often um,
Yeah.
quite gendered. I think the gender component of it is super important.
Well,
And I do have a thought about the title track, but maybe we can come to that in a second.
go ahead.
Okay, well, so I, I mean, I just think that the title track is just such a vivid evocation of a kind of broader sort of it's hard to describe, but a sort of broader set of social problems that afflict kind of modern societies that I feel like I encounter in my everyday life quite quite frequently. Let me briefly explain why. So
Please do.
I teach students. I teach undergraduate students, right? So who are typically aged between 18 and 22, 23. And one thing that has been really saddening over the past sort of 5 to 10 years is just the increase in the number of students and young people in the UK and I guess in the US as well, who are experiencing really quite serious mental health problems, right? And
Oh
it's
yeah,
been
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
and it's been a really challenging thing to have to respond to at work, because obviously I'm a politics nerd, I'm not a mental health practitioner, but so many of our students are presenting with a range of mental health problems. And I think what's interesting is that, again, there's a standard view of mental health, which is that it's kind of an intrinsic sort of feature of people's sort of psyche, if you like. It's specific and intrinsic to them. And then there's another view, which I suppose is the one I would go along with, which is a more social socially conscious view, which sort of wants to highlight the ways in which this epidemic of mental health um, problems that we see among young people today is, in my view anyway, a kind of reflection um, of wider kind of social, political, and economic um, processes, whereby, I mean, to put it simply, like young people, including young people from sort of relatively affluent middle class kind of backgrounds, the kind of kids that I teach at university, have much worse prospects than I did when I was their age, and certainly much worse prospects than when when my parents were their age. So I feel like the girl who is crying in her latte is almost a generational archetype, right? Um, and because so many of my students, they are young, they are predominantly women, right? Because more women than men take social science degrees in the UK. I don't know if the same is true in the US, but it is true in the UK.
Oh, sure.
And they are crying in their lattes. They are caffeinated. They have to drink coffee to kind of remain alert and remain awake, to kind of meet the demands that are placed upon them. And what I particularly love about the song, right, is the way in which it describes the fact that the sight or the moment of the girl crying in her latte is a recurrent thing, right? So it says, I can't remember the exact lyrics, but another girl comes in, orders the same, and then she's crying as well, and then they say, "Oh, I guess."
So many people.
I guess society's to blame, and then they say so many people are crying in their latte, and I was, it just feels like a very vivid evocation of basically like what I kind of encounter in my kind of day-to-day working life.
Well, you're giving me a new way of thinking about that
No,
song.
he said
Oh,
they say, guess the world is to blame. That's what they say. Yeah,
yeah,
like, I guess the
yeah,
world is to blame, right? So
yeah.
so the point is, it's not just that one person is sad, right? It's that there's something about the world that is creating this sort of sadness on a kind of industrial scale, that means that there are lots of girls, lots of people. I just think it's a really wonderfully chosen kind of um, sort of representation of these broader kind of social um, challenges and problems that we see. And so,
Well,
just one more thing about it is that what I love is that it's a really simple song. Like, in fact, I've seen people who've said, oh, actually, they don't actually like it because they don't think it's very lyrically rich, right? And it basically repeats the same kind of motif over again. And I can understand why people have that reaction. But I think the beauty of it is that it's so simple, right? It's such a simple little motif or vignette or whatever you want to call it, and yet it conveys so much, and it taps into something much bigger. And I just think that's
can
I
you
think that's great.
can
Yeah.
you no, it's definitely, I agree with everything you're saying. And can you there's another song on that album called You're Not That Well Defined.
Oh, yes, yes.
I'm wondering, I look at it as a certain way, but I wonder if you could take the approach that you kind of laid out as you thought about the Latte song and think about it in terms of that song. I'm sure you have.
I read the song as in some way poking fun at a certain kind of sensibility that I think is quite common in a lot of wider political discussion, or not necessarily sort of political discussion, but a sort of general kind of like discourse out in the world, which is that we tend to think of things in often quite simple, quite binary terms, right? So like, try and give an example. So so in the UK, for example, you know, we had a referendum in 2016 about whether we would leave the European Union, and one kind of legacy of that is that this is weakening now a little bit, but for a time, the categories of Brexiteer and Remainer became very like binary. It's like you're either one or the other, and never the
Right,
twain shall
right.
meet. And obviously
I've had
that's,
that experience. Yes.
yeah, sure, right, and that's been a common experience in the political cultures of lots of countries over the past, 10 or so, 10 or so years. And I feel like the song Not That Well Defined, it is sung sort of mockingly from the point of view of somebody who is trying to insist on the simplicity of the world, right? And says, things are either black or white, right? And they're frustrated by this encounter with something or someone which is not categorizable according to these
Right.
binary oppositions that sort of
Right.
um, shape our wider political culture. But I fully concede, even more so than with the other ones, that is me kind of imputing my own frustrations about the world into a Spark song, and maybe that's not what was intended at all. But um, I
Well,
think it's a I think it's
maybe it
something
was what was intended.
that
I
can
mean,
be read.
that's the beauty of Sparks, is that people can
Yeah,
relate
yeah.
on such a personal level. And
Sorry, just quickly. In some ways, what Ron himself intended is kind of doesn't really matter, really. I mean,
that's the
I think,
nature of art. There's a
yeah,
great quote
yeah.
somebody gave me about that. And unfortunately, I don't remember it, but I will put it down there so people can see it. But that's the nature of art.
Yeah.
So what I want to do now is to thank you. This was beyond expectations. This was a great conversation. Well, all right, that's not fair. My expectations were high, so I should say it. Even then, it exceeded expectations.
Oh,
This was
thank you.
really a terrific conversation, and I think you've given people a really valuable couple of perspectives that all tie
Oh, I hope so.
together.
I hope so.
And I just can't thank you enough for joining me and having this conversation.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. No, a lovely way to spend a few hours on a Saturday afternoon thinking about Sparks and trying to. Yeah, it's funny because as I'm talking, I realize that my thoughts about some of these issues are not quite as sharp as I think they could be. So talking about them has been really really interesting and really helpful. So thank
Well,
you.
that's great, and it's great that it can work that way. It can be a two-way uh, uh, conversation. But what I want to do is turn directly to the audience and just say, I often talk here when we wrap it up about how important it is to subscribe because because of the YouTube algorithms, and also it just
Yeah,
shows
yeah,
the
yeah,
commitment. But
yeah.
I want to say something else, which is that this show is bringing content like what you just heard. This is something that people need to hear. It's important, it's fascinating, and I really want I want to have that support for the show because I want more people to be able to hear things like what Jonathan Dean said, like so many of the other guests said. It's really important. So let's do this together. We're part of a community, and Jonathan, you are now part of this community. So thank you
Yeah,
again.
great. Yeah.
And we will wrap up, and I will say thank you to everyone watching. Thank you again. And we're wrapping up. So I will see you soon with a new episode. And this is Monty signing off.